Good morning. I'm going to be starting a commentary on the 14th lecture of the Foundations of Esotericism. We're getting to the sort of central part of this lecture cycle that's going to require some long ponderings. This video may turn out to be a little longer than the other ones in that there's a bit of a commentary to be made on two levels here in this particular lecture. Let me take a quick look and see, what did I call this lecture? I called it, here we go, I called it Life After Death and Relationship as a Spiritual Development. So we're starting to look at the effects of karma. So the physical world is the world of causes, and in the spiritual world is where we feel the effects. And so the one interesting, or some of the interesting things that are said in this particular lecture at the beginning is that Steiner starts to develop the idea that relationship can be a spiritual development of spiritual senses. So he differentiates between different kinds of relationships. So there are relationships that are built through karma. There are relationships that are built through the blood relationships that we have. But he also says that we also have, not everything that comes towards us is karmic. So this is a wonderful thing, because it's often touted around us here in the anthroposophical worlds or the worlds of reading Rudolf Steiner that everything's karmic. But it isn't. So there's a number of places in his teachings where Steiner says we might need to start to learn that not everything that happens to us happens due to karma. That some things happen to us that were not planned as part of what we need to take on in our destiny. That then obviously becomes destiny and carries its own karma, but the fact that it happened to us is something that we hadn't anticipated. This brings into the idea that, you know, in Steiner's philosophy, that there is an end point, that there is something we're working towards. It's not a very popular way of looking at the world at the moment, that there is actually meaning and direction and an achievement point, a teleology, an end point to which we are working. Something that we can also ponder in our own philosophies. What do you think the meaning of the journey on Earth is about? Does it actually have something, an aim to it? But yes, it's interesting that we can develop relationships, as he says, on an intellectual and a moral basis, soul to soul. And that through developing these relationships that are not brothers and sisters, that are not karmic relationships, we can find friendships based on an intellectual and a moral basis, soul to soul. We can have a powerful means of developing what at this point he calls devachanic organs. In no way can devachanic organs be more easily developed at present than by such relationships. That's an amazing picture, and I find quite an exciting picture, that we can actually find people through whom we relate, not because of karma, not because of blood, but make decisions to relate through an intellectual and a moral basis. And through that friendship, we create calls. I'm busy doing lecture 14. For those who are beginning to watch right now, we're busy working on lecture 14. So the idea that we can foster purely soul relationships, the organs for seeing into the spiritual world can begin to develop. This brings up all sorts of interesting thoughts around who we choose to be around beyond our families, our blood relationships, and our karmic relationships. This doesn't mean that we should avoid those relationships. In fact, we need to foster those relationships to be deeply involved on the earth. But there is another kind of relationship where we choose to be with someone out of a moral principle, and that through that there is a path of spiritual development where the transformation of the physical senses are developing out of the nature of the relationship, that we are doing higher development. So that's one very interesting aspect of this lecture that gives us pause to ponder what is that, the social life, and which groups of people do we choose to be associated with, and the work we do together in the world as part of our spiritual development and not just as part of our karma. Very interesting. So this is why the physical world is the world of causes, and the spiritual world is where we benefit the effects of what we do in the world, and especially through these relationships of conscious choice in a way. So where do we have places where we can do that? He then goes into another realm of talking about our work in the post. He starts to develop the post-death experience, and towards the end of it, I'm going to make a slightly longer commentary on where he starts talking about initiation. So as we start to develop perceptions and understandings beyond the physical plane, as we've come to call it, as we start to be able to see in the world of life, in the world of the soul, in the world of the spirit, in the past, these have been called the initiates. And he talks about 3 stages of initiation towards the end of this lecture. So he says, at first, we start to penetrate the veil. So a comment to that is, as we have gone through the evolution of consciousness, we've seen that the physical body and the etheric body and the astral body have coalesced out of the Akasha substance, and with that there's been a veiling of consciousness, our capacity to actually see and perceive the spiritual world. But we now need to raise those veils, which is known as an apocalypse, a lifting of the veil towards these things. And each veil that we lift is another stage of initiation, or the beginning of another faculty within us of soul and spiritual senses. He says the first step is to go beyond space and time and build ourselves a tabernacle there. And again, in these lectures, we see how Steiner's starting to develop his own understanding of the effects of the Christ force, of the Christ consciousness in the evolution of consciousness and the process of evolution. And in these particularly 3 stages, he's talking about the Jesus initiate being able to be ready to receive the Son Spirit, the Christ Spirit. And in the Christian language, this building of the tabernacle is going up the mountain to pray, is some of the language used in the mythologies that we know as the Gospels or the mythic initiation stories, when we hear that Jesus went up with his disciples to pray on the top of the mountains, again going beyond space and time, allegorically or mythologically, to start building the tabernacle within which we can begin to perceive in his worlds. And then he brings in an interesting second and third stage. He says at the second and third stage, we start to develop a consciousness that is in a state of pralaya. So pralaya, in Rudolf Steiner's early language, is like a sleep space, or a space between death and rebirth, where we are not coalesced into the physical body, but we are in a spiritual space that processes the effects of the cause in the physical world. I'm just going to look at the back of the book here, because he also gives us a wonderful word for the opposite of the pralaya. So when we have the pralaya, we have the opposite of the sleep condition, and then we also have a manvantara. A manvantara is the time where we are forced into time and space in the physical body. So the cosmic day and the cosmic night, so to say. So between 2 processes, we have day and we have night, where the human being is awake in the physical body, and then we process things at sleep. A slightly bigger version of that would be when we have our life of 70 to 80 to 90 years. We're in a manvantara, a cosmic day of consciousness, and then we go into a pralaya, or a process where we digest and prepare the next one. And so too does the earth bodies have a pralaya and a cosmic day. So we could say that at the moment the earth is in a cosmic day. And as we get to these second and third levels of initiation, we get into larger and larger aspects of the time, or the consciousness that is between time and spaces, at bigger and bigger rounds of existence. Now this is going to be where it becomes quite interesting and complicated for us to be able to understand these things. I'm going to try and give a verbal scheme. It's well worth trying to write or draw these schemes. I've just done that myself. I'll show you the page that I've actually written up to try and prepare this talk, because it's quite complicated and very hard to keep in our heads. But we've been working with the idea that evolution, driven by consciousness, that then has its effect into the evolution of species and adaptation. So we have a sort of a spiritual evolution of consciousness that then works in as a dreaming, as a seed, as a formative force into matter and the evolution of species and the adaptation of species So we could say, in a sense of an Aboriginal spirituality or a spiritual science, that consciousness comes to bear upon matter rather than consciousness arises out of matter. So we have, in Steiner's sort of understanding of evolution, these three dynamics: consciousness, life, and form. In order for something to change or come about, it has to go through stages of consciousness that then bring about, through life and forms, something new in the world. And so I'm going to try and describe that. We have, so far in this lecture cycle, talked about the 7 stages of consciousness. We're in the 4th stage of consciousness, developing the waking stage in the physical material world. But we've had 3 suns before this. In Steiner's language, they're known as Saturn and the Sun and the Moon, and we're now on the Earth Sun in our present sort of solar system. And these stages of consciousness have gone from a deep trance-like state to dreamless sleep, to the dreaming, and now to waking intellectual reasonable consciousness. And they've 3 future forms that will evolve through these things. And these are the 7 stages or planetary evolutions. And they are conditions of consciousness. And between each of them, there's a huge pralaya. So the first sun had a pralaya where things were digested and then recoalesced into the 2nd stage. And within each of these stages, we have a sort of a cosmic daytime and then a cosmic nighttime. And we're in the 4th stage of that. And then each of these stages, each of these 7 stages, has another process within them. So we're not just going to take one of those 7 stages, and they have 7 rounds or conditions of life. So in this particular lecture cycle, Rudolf Steiner calls them rounds or conditions of life. So therefore, in each planetary evolution, so like we are now on the Earth planetary evolution, we're going to have 7 rounds. There are 7 rounds, and we are in the 4th round. So we could say we are in the 4th stage, which is the Earth stage, and we are in the 4th round of the Earth, which is the mineral kingdom. That's why everything is so deeply physical. And these are the conditions of life or kingdoms. So we have to go through various kingdoms of development. So the condition has to go through different kingdoms of life in order to mature and bring about an evolutionary process. And between each of those rounds, there's another kind of digestive, shortish sleep or cosmic night. And now we're going to go even closer to home. Each of these rounds, so each of the big stages has 7 rounds, but each of those 7 rounds has 7 conditions of form. So we could say that every Earth evolution, so we're in the 4th Earth evolution, and that has 7 rounds or conditions of life, has 7 conditions of form, which makes it 49. And the middle point of those 49 conditions of form would be the 25th. And we are on the Earth in the 25th condition of form. So the 25th condition of form is known as the physical. So we are on the Earth, we are in the mineral kingdom, and we are in the physical condition of the Earth evolution. So we are at the most condensed, isolated condition that humanity in our whole evolution has ever known. We are most individuated, and therefore Steiner's quite clear that in this time we need to start drawing things. So that's kind of the beginning of the situation. Now, each of these conditions of form obviously has a slightly has another 3 levels of 7 within it. So we are in the 4th condition of form, in the 4th mineral round, in the 4th stage. But we have in these things, this is where we need to change our language a little bit. Steiner says that each of these conditions of form has 7 root races. Now, we would need to find another word for those, but we could say that that is an evolutionary process, if you want, for it, rather than the word race today is no longer very PC to use, so we need to find other words. But we could say that our 7 root races have been in anthroposophical language, it is known as the Polaris race, when humanity was developing at the poles, and then the Hyperborean, and then the Lemurian, and the Atlantic root race, and then we are now in what is known as the first post-Atlantic root race, and there'll be 2 more to come. So we are sort of, the Atlantis was the 4th, the middle point of our sort of developmental phase, and we are now in the 5th sub-race of that. So each of these root races has 7 sub-races. This is where in Steiner's language, we've been speaking about this, each of these sub-races, or cultural epochs is a better word for it, has the same time frame as the passage of the sun through the zodiac, so 2,160 years. So we have the ancient Indian cultural epoch, the ancient Persian, then this is very Eurocentric, of course, but it's in a particular area of the earth, the Chaldean and the Egyptian time, and then the Greek-Roman and Semitic development, and now we are in the 5th cultural epoch, which is the Western European epoch. That doesn't mean that anywhere else on the earth doesn't have any contribution to this, but that goes beyond the scope of this lecture. So we are just past the middle point of the earth evolution. If we say that Atlantis was the middle point, we are now 1 step further, and we are sort of in the middle of 1 step further. And each of these cultural epochs of 2,160 years, ours starting in the beginning of the 15th century, so the beginning of the materialistic age, the industrial revolution, is definitely the densest that it has been so far. So the industrial revolution, we know that the sort of the speed with which technology and the materialistic development has come very strongly since about the 1400s. Each of these areas, so 2,160 years from about 1400, we're about 1/3 of the way through that, has 7 what he calls governances or inner gestures by the archangels. And our sort of archangelic guidance started at the end of the 19th century, in 1879, under the guidance of Michael, where the sense of individual freedom comes to the fore in a new way through this materialistic age. So that verbally is a picture. We see that there are time frames, time rhythms within rhythms within rhythms. So the smallest one being 300 years times 3, 2,160 years, and 7 of those creating a developmental phase. And we're in the middle of that developmental phase within the whole Earth evolution, which is then in the middle of 7 phases of the evolution of consciousness. Very large timescales, very complicated to try and hold within us. But to try and get a quintessence of that, Steiner says that because we're in this phase of such deep veiledness from the spiritual world, the person who unfolds organs of higher perception, and in this particular lecture he talks about that being through relationships of choice, not relationships of blood and karma, but that we can find groups of people whom we consciously choose to relate to, and through those relationships we can begin to unveil the organs of perceptions, and we start to be able to see, so to say, out of the cosmic nights that are between these various rhythms, larger and larger periods. At this lecture only goes to 3 stages of initiation, the first being building the tabernacle on the mountain, which would be to be beyond space and time, you could say, almost being able to understand what lives between my cosmic day of my life and my pralaya, my life between this life and the next life. But we can also go to higher levels of perception where we get into the spaces between the rounds and the globes, so between the different epochs and the guidances by the guidance of the intentions of particular rhythms that are not too large by standards, but obviously then there will be higher stages of initiation understanding where we can get to higher and higher understandings of what works between these large cycles of times and see the intentionality within the consciousness. So, sorry that's a bit complicated, but it is a very important foundation for understanding the rest of Steiner's work. And if you do happen to have bought the book Foundations of Esotericism, there are diagrams at the back of the book that I drew that up from. But it's worth pondering and repondering and trying to vision how these rhythms work into each other, because much of what we spoke about in the last lecture, the guidance of the hierarchies, and then the work of this dreaming through these cycles of times, is very important to understand the teleology, in other words, the ultimate aim of the evolution of consciousness that works through these different ways, and starts to see that it's not just a random journey on earth, but there are particular cultural tasks that we all have, and where we are placed on earth and the relationships we build are very essential in building our capacity to unfold the higher virtues of the human soul that we live with. So that's what I've understood from this lecture, albeit a very short but pithy lecture. So wishing you a good day. Have a good weekend. Cheers.